Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute Next Round podcast. I'm Tim Anaya, your co-host, PRI's Vice President of Marketing and Communications. And in this week, for my colleague, Rowena Itchon, is PRI's Communications Director, Matt Fleming. Matt, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I am great. Well, as we kick off the week here, first of all, it's April Fool's Week. And of course, legislators and our policy-making friends in Washington, well, they might have lots of what we hope are April Fool's jokes in order for us. And the biggest one of the week, of course, is going to be the potential levying of tariffs on April 2nd, which President Trump is calling Liberation Day. And for our listeners, so as of this taping on Monday afternoon, kind of unclear what the tariffs are going to be and what the level is going to be, and also what the exemptions are going to be, because it's clear there are going to be several exemptions. But President Trump is kind of framing them as reciprocal tariffs, meaning, well, if you charge us a 10% tariff on something, we're going to charge you a 10% tariff back. We will see. It remains to be seen if that will change the behavior of those around the world who are charging these tariffs. But if you read the work of our economist, Dr. Wayne Weingarten, it seems pretty clear the result of these tariffs, whatever form they come, is going to be Americans paying higher prices for goods. And if you watch the stock market in the United States and around the world going down, that's probably the most likely result of these tariffs coming on board. Matt, what say you on our April Fool's, well, really April 2nd tariff imposition deadline?
Well, I would also like to see, of all the things you mentioned, it's not quite clear. There's a lot of unanswered questions. I'd also like to know the answer to what Liberation Day intends to liberate. I think that certainly reading the story was depressing. There's two arguments for tariffs, right? There's the argument that it's going to, I guess, harm foreign imports and somehow promote domestic production. The other thing that it is allegedly going to do is bring people to the negotiating table. And economist after economist has pointed out, A, how the first one is wrong. And they've also pointed out how ultimately this leads to a trade war, which we're starting to see now. I mean, I guess I'm trying to be measured in how I respond to this, but there just doesn't seem to be a point to it. And it's not going to bring back jobs in the way they think it's going to. Studies show from the last time that, A, the jobs that some tariffs did bring back cost taxpayers something like $600,000 a job. And for every job it brought back, we lost others in other segments. Like, there's a reason why free trade has sort of been the economic standard over the last, I don't even know what, over 100 years. There's a reason why it brought unprecedented wealth to the United States and other developed nations. And I don't know. I mean, as you'll hear in our interview with Tom Campbell, across the board, Milton Friedman, Thomas Sowell, Larry Summers, everyone from just across the board, liberal to conservative economists hate the idea of tariffs. And then just to win a pointless argument, I tried looking up even what Karl Marx thought, and even he hated tariffs. I mean, there really is very few people who think this is a good idea. So I just don't really know what to say. I mean, it's like it's almost exasperating because it's just driving the economy into a hole, making things much more expensive when they were already expensive, and all for what? To promote a fantasy.
Now, on that point of things being more expensive, I was most alarmed when reading about the tariffs to learn about this supposedly threatened tariff on wine and spirits coming from Europe in response to how the European Union may respond to the president's imposition on tariffs later this week. And the European Union has been threatened with a 200% tariff on European-made liquor, and that includes our favorite French champagnes like Veuve Clicquot. And so I got to thinking when I saw that, number one, I need to run right out and buy some of that while it's still on the store shelves at the lower prices, which I did. I got the last two bottles at Costco. But Well, what are some affordable US made alternatives to French champagne if we have a long trade war and, champagne prices go up 200 to 300%, which may very well be the case. And of course, that would also mean that, they're not going to be stocking it as much on US store shelves. So I looked and I have a blog post that's coming out soon that will give you my recommendations for some American-made champagnes or really sparkling wines, because only something from the Champagne region of France can technically be a champagne, but some California-based sparkling wines that make their product in the vein of wines produced in France. So I encourage you to check out my blog, which will be up soon at our Right by the Bay. And as an added bonus, not only are they made in California, wouldn't be subject to the tariffs, but all three of the ones that I profile in my blog are each more affordable than Veuve Clicquot. So check it out. But there is, and some of these I've tried, some of them I have not yet tried, but it is a reminder that, there is a good alternative for that. I'm also researching what would some good tariff-free alternatives to tequila be if the major tariffs go into effect on Mexico. And that is a more interesting one as I am researching. So, but I encourage you to check out that piece and the subsequent piece at PRI's Right by the Bay. So, Matt, this week, as you mentioned, we have really a terrific guest, one of the smartest people in, well, the world, but California for sure, and that's Tom Campbell, former congressman, former state senator, former California director of finance, constitutional scholar, now at the Chapman University School of Law. And we thought when talking about these issues of tariffs, when talking about these issues of DOGE and government waste and all the legal issues surrounding whether what DOGE is doing is legal or not, we thought who better to have on than someone who's not only a brilliant constitutional scholar, but was rated as one of the best fighters of government waste during his tenure in Congress. And so if you're interested in all of these issues, plus we also talk tariffs, I think you're really going to be in for a treat this week, because Tom does not disappoint and gives us all a very interesting lesson on all of these sorts of issues.
I can't say enough nice things about Tom. He's been just such a great elected official, such a great law professor. His op-eds in the Orange County Register are phenomenal. He's helped me out a lot with my own reporting. And the only real negative thing I can say about him is that he's not still in elected office. I would vote for him every day of the week. So hopefully everyone finds this interview great. We could have talked to him. We ran long, and we could have talked to him for another 2-3 hours.
I think that's right. And Matt, I know you'll be jealous to learn that I did have the pleasure of having Tom Campbell as my congressman, and he was a great representative. He was also later a great colleague of mine in the Schwarzenegger administration. His office was 2 doors down from the wacky people in the speechwriting office. So just a brilliant, brilliant individual, and so pleased to present this to you. So after the break, please enjoy our conversation with Tom Campbell. We'll get back to our great guest in just a moment. But first, are you following PRI on Facebook? By following PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, that's all one word, you'll be the first to read free market ideas from PRI's terrific team of scholars on all the hot issues like education freedom, single-payer healthcare, crime, homelessness, green mandates like the ban on natural gas appliances, and more. Plus, when you follow PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, you'll be the first to know when tickets go on sale for PRI's must-attend luncheons, dinners, and galas across the state. And you'll be first in line to secure your spot to hear great speakers like Michael Schellenberger, Gordon Chang, Steve Hilton, and many more. So go to facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute and follow PRI today so you'll be the first to know. Well, Tom, it's great to have you on Next Round to discuss a topic that we thought you might have a few things to say about, both as a constitutional law scholar and as benefited me as a former constituent of yours, the number one rated fighter of government waste when you were in Congress. And that's all this effort with DOGE. So I think it's important in the discussion. And, we hear about the legal cases, but we just hear this was filed in court or that was a judge put in an injunction. But I think the legal side of this is very interesting. As our listeners know, the Trump administration moved very quickly to try to shut down some of these big agencies like USAID and the Department of Education. And, not surprisingly, interest groups and state attorney generals, including, California's Rob Bonta in many cases, are arguing that a lot of these moves are unconstitutional. So what's your view? Do these legal challenges have merit? And maybe, in that answer, you could talk about too, well, what powers does a president have to try to cut back or shut down a federal agency?
That's very broad powers, is my quick answer. And the possibility of actually accomplishing this enhanced if the president and the administration would follow established law for doing so. So among these steps is a enforce RIF, as we call it, and the RIF can be implemented by a federal agency. There are standards set in the Code of Federal Regulations for doing so. And that's the president's sole discretion. He says that there's a need for workers in an agency. They set about steps for giving notice and opportunity for employees who need to move or who need to hear alternatives even within the agency. What's troubling me in that area right now is that the administration is ignoring that process, and so they will be held to have broken the law, not necessarily the Constitution, but law that governs reductions. Concerning reclassifying employees, the president has, I would say, very close to unreviewable discretion to say that this job will now be considered a policy job. And as a result, you serve at the president's discretion. And so you're taken out of the protections of the general schedule, which apply to the rank and file, and are treated the way an assistant secretary, secretary. And that's perfectly legal, and it can be done well if you follow the established regulations. If you don't, a federal district judge will issue a TRO telling you to go back and do it right. This happened with the first administration, President Trump. He attempted to establish limits on immigration. You all might remember. It was inaccurately called, but critically, disparagingly called the anti-Muslim rule or Muslim ban on immigration. It took the president 3 times until he figured out that there is a process for the president to say, I am using the immigration laws to exclude criteria. And the criteria were, are you coming in from a country whose vetting process not trust, does not have anything to do automatically being a Muslim country. So yes, it can be done, and there's laws to do it, and it doesn't delay it all that much, perhaps 2 or 3 months at max, and the core challenges would be defeated. Lastly, can the president shut down an agency entirely? No, that requires a statute. So the Department of Education would require a law, and the president's admitted this. Individual programs within the agency, individual contracts that have been given out, for example, by USAID, can be interrupted if they haven't yet been approved. But if they have gone officially through the process and have been approved, then the Supreme Court dealt with this in 1976, said, no, if they've gone through the process and all that's remaining is writing the check, a federal court can and will order the check to be issued. That happened when President Nixon decided to terminate a contract that had already been let for clean water to the city of New York. President Nixon's premise that we had a budget deficit and he was going to in impoundment. So instead of doing what the president did on USAID regarding the contracts that were already let, he could have said no more. Just what's ever been done, we're going to follow through, but no more. So in general, in all the areas I've talked about, there's a process for doing it. And if the administration follows it, they're likely to be allowed by a court to do so.
In thinking about it and having worked in, state government, certainly for many years before coming to PRI, that was kind of my gut reaction too. You see it, whenever you do a quote reorganization of a department, it seems like that's the kind of legal way where you can sort of make some of these changes. And certainly, if you want to make some personnel changes, that's kind of your opportunity to do that. I guess the big question, of course, is, well, if there is a way to do it the right way, why wouldn't you do it the right way?
I think the president was very intent on getting results quickly. And that, I believe, is why he did not follow the normal process. Really would have been delayed matters only several months, perhaps as long as 3 months, probably not longer in most instances. So that's my best answer, Tim, that it was a desire to get results. The phrase in Silicon Valley is move fast and break things. And he's done both.
That's right.
So along those lines, and you kind of touched on the president's authority to manage the federal workforce, but there was an interesting, a specific thing that happened a little while back where he offered buyouts, and that itself was sort of met with a lot of resistance. And to that last question, I wonder too. He wanted results fast, but he also, I think he feels like the bureaucracy got in the way of him implementing what he wanted to do, which sort of ties into this whole reduction of the federal workforce thing. But so he offered these buyouts, and that was, of course, met with resistance and met with legal challenges. And within that, it seems like there are three things happening. There's, Congress's expectation that money be appropriated as it's spent, as spent as appropriated, the president's ability to manage the federal workforce, and the process in place for terminating federal employees, and also this idea that he's offering buyouts without an appropriation. It just seems like the buyouts itself probably are the most humane way of reducing a workforce, probably the most effective way of reducing a workforce besides just shutting everything down. But at the same time, it's not entirely clear that he had the power to do it. I mean, can you help us kind of walk through all of the sort of competing factors here?
Sure. The buyouts required there to be budgetary authority to pay. And of course, the budgetary authority runs out the end of the government fiscal year. So the difficulty legally is, can the president make a promise to pay, which is the buyout for, after number one, when the Constitution says no expenditure of money on an appropriation. The federal government may not spend money except upon an appropriation in Congress. So what he should have done, I think, instead, is to make the offer up to the time when the present budget runs out. And he may get fewer takers then, but not go into the area where the years when the budget. Once they approve a new budget, hopefully before December, so we don't have a shutdown crisis, then he could make the offer extend beyond that. That could be relatively easily fixed. You mentioned, Matt, the most humane way. I think that's going to touch a fair number of people's hearts as well as their minds. Working for the federal government is an honor. I had the privilege to do so as a general schedule employee before I ever was in politics. And overwhelmingly, most of my colleagues were proud and patriotic and happy to be serving their country. That's how I viewed my role when I ruled Civil Service Commission and the Department of Justice. As a non-political in the Civil Service Commission. So why fire probationary employees with a notice saying that your work has been unsatisfactory? Well, because that was what the rule said you had to say in order to get them to go, but wasn't not to get them to go in order to fire them. But they weren't unsatisfied, and that's a judgment that was made on a cookie cutter basis without authorized finding, and an individual's career is going to be impacted by that. Have you ever left a job because your employer said you were unsatisfactory? I've gotten that question on virtually every employment form I've ever filled out, and now you'd have to say yes or be responsible for having said something untrue. So it could have been done more humanely, as well as effective.
Yeah, and that's sort of an interesting point to make too, because on one hand you have these people getting fired for, like you said, what appear to be trumped up charges, no pun intended with the name there. But and then on the other hand, you have other people who are being offered this extremely generous buyout. It was, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was 9 months buyout, which I always joke with Tim that anytime anybody wants to offer me a 9 month buyout, I'm probably going to take it because it's just such a great deal.
You have a very high internal rate of discount.
Yeah, exactly. But so there's that sort of I don't know, we'll call it buyout envy, which creates sort of a weird circumstance. But then also, like, what is this like for, and is there sort of any legal repercussion for anyone who now, as you mentioned, the buyouts might not be on sound policy standing? What happens to someone who offered to take this buyout and then either A, is unable to collect the money because, it's not congressionally approved, and then now has outed themselves as someone who doesn't want to work there? I mean, I know there was a lot of people who were worried about taking the buyout because they thought that the administration would pull the rug out from under them. How does this? What should they be worried about, and do they have any sort of legal? Do they have any sort of legal protection there?
I believe that they have legal protection, but it will come about slowly. It would be in a lawsuit in the Court of Claims. So the federal government has sovereign immunity. It has opened itself to suits for money damages in the area of tort, and in the area of civil claims, you go to the claims after you have been denied. If the person who took the buyout is not receiving the money after September 1 because the government has no appropriation thereafter, then that individual could go to the court. Well, that's a technical and legal answer, but it's hardly satisfactory if you make a career decision based on having your. Also, bear in mind, unlike you, Matt, I don't think one would say that that your employer gets no value from you, so you may as well go home. I mean, you provide value to your employer,
Yeah.
and even if we can have a disagreement on this or that USAID program or this or that Department of Education, to say we're going to pay you for doing nothing is, I think, just on its face, a bad deal for the government. Say it's generous. Well, yes, paying a person for doing nothing implies that the government won't lose anything because they're presently doing nothing valuable. I think that's a false premise. Make the call on the merits. What you do in administering programs for malaria in Africa is worthwhile, but we don't have the money to do it. I think other agencies should be involved from other countries. Therefore, we're going to terminate the program. I would probably vote no on that if I were still in Congress, but I can understand somebody making the case on the other side. Make the case instead of saying, we'll just close it down.
Just released from Encounter Books, read the new book from PRI's Sally Pipes, The World's Medicine Chest, available now at your favorite online bookstore. The World's Medicine Chest explores how America became the world's leader in biopharmaceutical innovation through market capitalism. But as Sally Pipes writes, America is the last best hope for millions around the world who are battling rare diseases and chronic conditions. As you'll read in the World's Medicine Chest, we can do more to fight and cure disease, but only if we continue to embrace private sector innovation over government regulation. Buy the World's Medicine Chest today at Amazon.com or your favorite online bookseller. Along those lines, as a legendary former fiscal hawk in Congress, what's your view, apart from the legal questions, of kind of how DOGE has been targeting government waste? Are these the areas that you, as a government waste fighter, would be focusing on if you were still in Congress today? And then there's obviously becomes the congressional role in this. How should the House and the Senate approach what DOGE is doing? And, there might be a bigger question here too, right? Is, what does it say about Congress's lack of budget cutting over the years that, it's taking this great innovator and entrepreneur to kind of prod Washington into getting serious about cutting government waste?
Very good observation. That is fundamentally the problem, is Congress has not done its job. Congress has spent more money than it has for each year now in this century, since the year 2000. So yes, first and primary fault is on the shoulders of Congress. Second, what is the best way to go about fiscal responsibility? Well, I thought Graham Rudman Hollings was a very good approach back in the later part of the 20th century. I came in about 1980, 86 or 87. Could be wrong on that, but the idea was, here's a budget that's overspending more than we bring in. We will cut according to this schedule, and if we don't succeed in doing so, there will be an across-the-board cut. So you had a real enforcement mechanism. I think that's what's missing in the present approach. President Obama had a task force involving the Senate and the House that was going to propose entitlement reform. You might remember. They came up with some recommendations, but it did not have the opportunity that Graham Rudman Hollings did, which is this will go into effect if a majority of the House and the Senate vote for it, no amendments. in other words, once you allowed amendments into the system, like Graham-Rudman's across the board, no amendments. Once you allow amendments into the process, then Republicans are never going to vote for a tax. Democrats are never going to vote for a spending decrease. And so that the initiative under President Obama failed. The mechanism needs to have an follow-up, and I believe the best we've ever seen is Graham-Rudman-Hollings. You might say it's the worst, except everything else. Now, if I were solely in charge of an authority to identify programs, obviously the entitlements are the big areas. It's politically very, very hard. But what you do by eliminating the entire Department of Education is not even rounding error for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. So are you saying that those should be on the table? I'm saying that you cannot be serious about the budget without considering entitlements. That's what I'm saying. And if that would prevent me from ever being elected, that's a shame on this. That's a shame.
I think that's a very important point that I wanted to underscore there. I spoke at a panel a couple of weeks ago, and the big topic at that time was the state Medicaid cuts and how vulnerable members of Congress might deal with it. And everybody was talking about the dollar amount, but people always forget, yes, there's the dollar amount, but you're saying we can't deliver services better, more effectively, more efficiently, use technology to deliver services better, that, you could achieve significant savings while constituents might get the same or even better delivery of services and delivery of care. And, I think that's Congress and Washington never really look at those sorts of things, or at least they don't enough. But I feel like this is a great opportunity, if done right, where you could do that.
Very well said. And today's Wall Street Journal has an article that really makes your case. Perhaps you saw the article that over the from 2019 to 2021, over $4 billion of Medicaid were made to people who claimed the same reimbursement from two different states. So two different insurance companies were being paid by the federal government. The totals were 4.3 billion 2019 to 2021. And in the year 2021, it was over 2 billion. So that there's an example of where the insurance companies it didn't result in more money to the individual. It was twice as much money to the insurance company. So why could we not have found that out? And if you have a hammer, the enforcement mechanism, such as Graham-Rudman-Hollings that I spoke about, across the board cut if you don't do it otherwise, then people have a tremendous incentive to find this sort of thing and implement it. And that I think was the plus side of DOGE. That's the beneficial side, having an outsider take a look at this.
Let's switch to another favorite topic here real quick. The topic of tariffs. You mentioned earlier that you weren't a fan of tariffs. Certainly at PRI, we've done extensive work on the harmful effects of tariffs. We're not supporters of it. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find an economist on either side who is a supporter of tariffs. I even, just for what it's worth, looked up what Karl Marx thought about tariffs. I was trying to win a useless argument, and truth is, even he thought they were a bad idea. So anyone from Milton Friedman to Thomas Sowell to Larry Summers to Karl Marx, I mean, tariffs are pretty widely frowned upon, and yet here we are. The president is trying to impose tariffs on Canada, for example, under the stated reason of citing the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, centering on issues of fentanyl trafficking. Can you review for our listeners the president's powers to impose tariffs? And in the case of the Canadian and Mexican tariffs, is the president on solid legal grounds in your view? And obviously, if you have an economic view you'd like to share, feel free to do that as well.
I'd like to address the legal and the economic.
Sure.
Legal, the president is on shaky ground. The International Economic Emergency Powers Act is the successor to the Trading with the Enemy. It requires the statement of an emergency by the president. And the original legislation required Congress gave the Congress the right to overturn the president's declaration of an emergency which on a simple vote of the House and not go to the president. Well, the Supreme Court has held that kind of structure unconstitutional after the International Economic Emergency Powers passed. Very unclear to me that Congress would ever have given that authority to the president if they didn't have that check and the check away, leaving a mangled statute. Secondly, the statute, the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, does not use the word tariff. Let me impress that on your listeners. You will not find the word tariff in the IEPA, and you don't find it in the Trading with the Enemy Act. So the president is claiming under some very broad language about and taking other steps that includes tariff. Now, the logic as a legal matter of doing that is very weak because there are specific statutes that deal with it. The Congress has the plenary authority over tariff in the Constitution. Then there are specific provisions when we negotiate tariff countries. You all remember fast track. That's what Congress delegates to the president for a short period of time the ability to negotiate tariff reductions on tariff increases. And all of that would be silly and useless if all it took was the president to declare an emergency, unreviewable declaration of an emergency, unless Congress passes a law by 2/3 of each house, because that's the presidential veto if there wasn't an emergency. And that, as I pointed out, is not in the law. So, second argument that why it's legal, why it's not strong legally, the tariff is not in there. What authority is given to the president is in such emergencies is to ban import. That's where you have a diplomatic, we will not import your products. Now, will you accommodate our foreign policy needs? That is a separate statute. There's a separate statute for balance of payments, where there is a balance of payments problem, and the opportunity is presented to impose the tariff in order to equalize the balance of payments problem. The word tariff is not in IEPA, and to give that power to the president from the generic phrase and such other methods undercuts the entire logic of the specific approaches for tariff include, and I'd be happy to go into them if you like, but fast track authority, the escape clause, which deals with industries that are being specifically damaged, the impairment of national security under Section 232 of the Trade Act, that deals where a particular product undermines our ability, for example, to ballistic missile, and 301, Section 301 of the which deals with specific, a lot on that, but all of it. I mean, it's not even on the one hand, on the other, all of it undercuts the president's authority. What the president has going for him is one Supreme Court opinion in 1976 under the escape clause when President Nixon imposed tariffs because of the oil. The escape clause requires findings that an American industry threatened by imports. That instance, and they have findings made by that agent. On the economics, can be very short-winded here. The most efficient tax is one which interferes with private market activity the least. Any sales tax imposes a dead loss. Any first-year microeconomist student will tell you that. And that's what we are doing on top of the fact that we are angering trading partners who will then retaliate.
So I think an interesting question, and you're uniquely situated to answer this question, is the view from the states. You know, many of our listeners may remember that in addition to your time in Congress and in the legislature, you also served as Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger's Director of Finance, 2 doors down from my office and the Wild Bunch in the speechwriting office. But certainly the DOGE effort and the federal government's budget cutting efforts, and then, you know, all the issues with how tariffs will impact the economy and huge industries in California like agriculture that are heavily dependent upon foreign trade, all of this is combining to make budget directors across the country sweat. So you've been in their shoes. What's your advice to them for how should they be budgeting during these uncertain times? Certainly both California and other states with all these economic jitters, but also the very uncertain federal funding priorities.
Great question, Tim. You need to protect against the contingency that there'll be a massive withdrawal of federal funds. In our state, we have the budget stabilization account. I know you remember that, Tim, and that's called a rainy day fund. Well, this could be a hurricane, not just a rainy day. The state has a maximum and a minimum. The minimum is 1.5% of the general fund has to go into the year. But the maximum is when you hit 10% of the general fund, then anything extra from the capital gains tax, if more than 8% of the revenue is, then the additional amount has to go into the fund unless it pours above 10%. If it's above 10% of the entire general fund, then it has to go to the schools and the K through 8. We need to double that. So we need to say 10 to 20%. Create a rainy day fund, the budget stable of 20%. That way you have a much more real. Secondly, the GAN limit, you're familiar with, part of the original Prop 13, actually followed up a separate and very close time to Prop 13, that said if the growth of state expenditure exceeds the population growth rate and the per capita income growth in the state, then the extra has to go into infrastructure. What Governor actually half to infrastructure, and the other half has to be returned to taxpayers. Governor Newsom pulled a fast one, and he said by giving the money to particular projects in areas that he considered were underserved, he was giving it back to tax. That's a wrong interpretation of the limit, and that it should be clearly interpreted that the money, I would say, to the stabilization instead of giving the governor this opportunity, as he did, money given to the GAN limit. So those are two structural changes. One, the GAN limit must be made clear that the money has to go back to taxpayers or into infrastructure. Should be made clear that sending it to the rainy day fund would also be acceptable. And the total number of 10% of the general fund should be. Those are rather detailed suggestions, but I'm trying my best. Question in a broader brush. The state needs to restrict its spending to the growth of income and the growth population and bring in the growth of spending less than that. Instead, that number is considered almost a target that we must spend that. No, we don't have to. And what I did in Congress that got me the kind of title that you described, the Taxpayers Foundation, that I got spending more than any other member of Congress, was a variation of Graham Rudman Holling. Across the board cuts, unless you come up with something that hit. And the attraction of across the board cuts is because everybody hates politically the consequence of having to cut a specific program. But if it is everyone in the same pot, it's being cut because everything is being cut. I think it blunts the political downside. And so it becomes more possible. So I would have a Graham Rudman Hollings approach as well in the state government. Worked in the federal government. Regrettably, it was a lot higher, and it needs to be reinstituted.
Well, as I always remind people at this time of year when we get into the state budget, the rainy day funds certainly, which was enacted in 2014, the current incarnation of it. It was long a priority of fiscal conservatives, and the GAN limit certainly many years before that. And what a perilous budget situation we'd be in if we didn't have that in place today.
So right. You're so right.
We'll get back to next round in just a moment, but first, are you getting PRI's regular email updates? If not, go to pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get the facts you need to fight back delivered every week to your inbox. Every week, PRI sends you what you need to know about what's going on in Washington, D.C. and Sacramento, and gives you the free market ideas needed to save our state and our nation. By going to pacificresearch.org and clicking the sign up button, you can sign up to have Policy Alert, our weekly roundup of all the best ideas from PRI scholars delivered to your inbox. Or you can sign up for event updates so you're the first to know when PRI is coming to your community with great events. So sign up now at pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get PRI's content delivered to your inbox each week.
So speaking of wasteful spending, if I'm being objective about it, a lot of the times wasteful spending is a blanket term, but when we're talking about specific expenditures, a lot of that is in the eye of the beholder. I always think back to the great John McCain, regularly going to the Senate floor to rail on wasteful spending programs, including his pet favorite wasteful spending program, which was the federal government having three, not one, not two, but three federal catfish inspection programs, and how he would always go to the floor and try to get rid of at least one of them. And then certainly with the USAID and, various other programs, DOGE has highlighted what it considers to be wasteful. And again, a lot of that is in the eye of the beholder. But in California, there are always these audits and LAO reports highlighting wasteful spending, and that's from the auditor and the LAO who are certainly not, dyed-in-the-wool fiscal conservatives. They might be into government efficiency, but they're certainly not like in the vein of Tom Coburn or anyone like that. And they'll highlight things, and then the department will come to a hearing and agree to do some of the recommendations, but maybe not all of it. And at the end of the day, nothing really ever seems to change. And two things that that have happened recently that stand out are reports on ineffective spending on homelessness, but ineffective both in not being tracked and also not tracking the programs themselves. But then also high-speed rail. I always joke with people that if you were to tell me that it was like a mafia grift where they were just trying to run up costs to embezzle money, it would make more sense than actually what the reality is, which is that it's just actually this inefficient. In your view, if California wanted to actually find places to make cuts that you would think would be sensible across the ideological spectrum, things where it's like it's obviously just bloated, obviously just being wasteful, and they could still accomplish their goal, but maybe doing it in a more effective way. I mean, what are some areas where you think that would even be possible?
The high-speed rail certainly is one. We know it's terribly over budget, but we could ask the question: is there a need for government opposed to relying on the private sector? Private sector is providing a high-speed rail from Los Angeles to Vegas. It's responding to market incentives, willing to stake a lot of on a bet that the cost per mile is substantially less than the has not even laid track. So I would say transportation. Secondly, Caltrans in general. When the Loma Prieta earthquake hit, Governor Wilson got the reconstruction of the freeways substantially lower cost by allowing outsourcing. When the Northridge earthquake hit, he was able to do it even more. And the changes in the Northridge came in under budget and faster than had. I think privatizing is a very important element of savings. Prisons, the opportunity to outsource our prison population to Arizona always appeals to me. The possibility of being criminal deterrence would be enhanced. I think Arizona is not a violation of the United States Constitution. I think we would know if we were. Why not outsource our prison housing population? And the answer is, of course, in each case is a very political one. We know the power of the public employee unions, and that I think is the reason why. So I would say an approach of deregulation and privatization. On the homeless front that you mentioned, the deregulation would be its answer. It should not cost $100,000 to build a single room occupancy unit, and I think the cost is much higher than that if you ever so eliminate the regulatory burdens, drive up that. As you both know, the cost of housing is overwhelmingly dominated by the access fees that are imposed by local government as a way of raising revenue. They're capped by the they will go to develop and charge them as a condition of getting a permit, so that what was an affordable house is no longer an affordable. Lastly, don't ignore the incentives here. If you give an agency head and the political around that agency head a budget that is 5% less, and no exceptions, we mean it, 5% less, you'd be surprised at ways they would find to save money, but they just have no such incentive.
Well, with all this, I don't know, maybe we could argue depressing talk today. Maybe our listeners might need a drink. And so we have our favorite question to always end our podcast here. So we call our podcast Next Round because of PRI's proximity to wine country and our love of discussing public policy over a great glass of California wine. I know, because I got a preview, you have a very interesting answer to this question. So what beer, wine, cocktail, or other beverage are you enjoying and can recommend to our listeners to enjoy, to maybe, I don't know, let loose after hearing all these depressing headlines in the newspaper each day?
Flat Coke. Get Coca-Cola, shake the bottle, put your thumb on top, shake it up and down, get rid of the carbon dioxide, and drink flat Coke. Even better if it's room temperature. This is how you succeed in life. It's that fundamental. Now, second is where you consume it becomes important too. Strongly recommend Denny's. Denny's is available across the state. The menu is the same, and you just point to what you want. There's pictures of every item. Also, it's always open, which leads me to ask, why are there locks on Denny's stores, on Denny's restaurant? Always open, Denny's, flat Coke, and they may even give you a discount if you mention my name.
Well, on that note, I feel like one of these days, Tom, Matt, and I should meet up with you at a Denny's and have some flat Coke.
Absolutely, and the Grand Slam. What could be better than that? Indeed, there's even an international Grand Slam because it includes French toast and Belgian waffle. So think of the opportunity.
Well, you're making us hungry and thirsty. And on that note, Tom, we couldn't thank you enough. Really enjoyed our discussion today.
My pleasure. Thank you for what you do as well.
Thank you.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.